Hello, everyone. My name is Rob Kozak, and I'm a proud UBC alumnus and Dean of the Faculty of Forestry. I'm delighted to be your host this afternoon. Originally, we intended to have a webinar on fires and floods, but unfortunately, our floods expert, Professor Eunice Alila, is no longer able to join us. But as the saying goes, the show must go on, so we quickly retooled our program to focus just on wildfires. So I just want to thank our development and alumni team at the Faculty of Forestry for their nimble work behind the scenes. I want to thank Professor Lori Daniels for agreeing to carry the load of being our lead presenter today. And I want to thank Joanna Wagstaff for helping to moderate today's event. I would also like to respectfully acknowledge that UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and that UBC Okanagan is situated on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Sayalks Okanagan Nation. For millennia, these sites have been places of learning where cultures and histories and traditions are passed on from one generation to the next. And it's very much in that spirit that we're gathered here today. I'd also like to recognize that many of you are joining us from a whole bunch of different places, near and far, and I would encourage you to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. By doing so, we're reminded that Canada's legacy of colonization continues into the present, and that all of us have an obligation to advance decolonization in this country and to make meaningful progress on the 94 calls to action set forth by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. So, on behalf of the Faculty of Forestry and alumni UBC, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us today, and thank you in advance for helping to create a respectful and inclusive environment for our speakers and audience members. A quick bit of housekeeping before I pass the mic on to our moderator. If anyone is experiencing any audio or video issues, please just reach out via the chat function feature in our GoToWebinar platform. So today we have a really informative and important and timely session lined up for you. Whether you're talking about atmospheric rivers or droughts or extreme heat events or floods or wildfires, we know one thing for certain. Our climate is changing rapidly and we need to act urgently. And so that as a backdrop, I can't think of a better person to help us navigate today's session than CBC's Joanna Wagstaff. Johanna is the on-air meteorologist, seismologist, and scientist for CBC Vancouver News and CBC News Network. She has a strong background in seismology and earth science and has covered national and international weather stories, including major seismic events, space missions, and the Copenhagen and Paris climate change conferences. She's also hosted 2 award-winning CBC Vancouver podcasts and continues to work on various CBC original podcast projects. So thank you for agreeing to moderate today's event. I'll pass the screen on to you. Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you so much, Rob. I'm thrilled to be here today, and I'm so happy to see so many of you also here today for such a crucial topic. It's also nice to see so many familiar faces. Just kidding, I can't actually see you, but there are over 1,100 of you that signed up for this dialogue today, which is incredible. And I think that in itself really shows the importance of this conversation. I'll be starting the dialogue off today with a chat with Professor Lori Daniels, and then during the second half of the webinar, we'll be taking questions from all of you, our viewers. So to do that, to ask a question of our speaker, we're using Slido, which is our online audience engagement platform. Your reminder email for this webinar included instructions on how to use Slido. So thank you for all of those questions that are already coming in. Please go to slido.com. If you have a question that comes up during the chat, you can also vote for your favorite questions, sort of like Reddit, it'll upvote it. And once you log on to slido.com, you can use our event code wildfires to sign in, and you'll see instructions on the screen. And the link is also being shared in our chat. There it is. Before we get started, Alumni UBC would like to thank their pillar partners, Manulife, TD Insurance, Avis Budget, and BMO Alumni UBC MasterCard for their support for this webinar. On behalf of Alumni UBC's official broadcast and online media partner, CBC Vancouver, I would also like to add how proud we are at CBC to support these important discussions in our community. And this truly is an important conversation. The world is heating up. I'm sure every single one of us here today has been impacted in some way in the past year by extreme events. The deadly heat dome. We're just hearing today from BC's chief coroner that the deaths officially have surpassed 600, and that's probably an underestimate. The devastating wildfires and the flooding that so many of us are still trying to recover from. It has truly been relentless. And even now, in the middle of one of our coldest and wettest springs in history for the province, you know you weren't going to get away without a brief forecast from me. Many of you are anxiously awaiting the full spring melt with an above seasonal snowpack as an unusually strong spring atmospheric river looms at the end of the week. And we know many of these extreme events were made much more likely because of climate change, and the impacts much more intense because of climate change. But we also know it's not the only factor that we've had a hand in. Our forest dynamics expert, Professor Laurie Daniels, is here to discuss the forestry practices that are shaping landscapes in BC and how the profession can help mitigate the impact of extreme weather-related events. It's now my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker today, Professor Laurie Daniels. Laurie Daniels is a professor of forest ecology with the UBC Faculty of Forestry and a proud UBC alumna. Laurie directs the Tree Ring Lab, where her research team reconstructs historical fire regimes, as well as the impacts of climate change and other human-related activities on forests. With her research team, Laurie is investigating wildfires and forest resilience to climate change in the interior of BC, national parks in the Rocky Mountain, and foothills of Alberta. And I just want to say Laurie has always been so generous to the media with her time, especially when it comes to public safety. And I tried not to fangirl too much when I ran into her for the first time as we were walking our dogs on the trails. Welcome, Laurie. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here today to share your wealth of knowledge and experience with all of us. I'd like to pass the virtual mic over to you now to set the stage for all of us. I mean, first of all, last year's fire event is obviously, the fire season is obviously one that won't soon be forgotten, but I was hoping you could give us a brief overview of the past 6 to 9 months here in British Columbia. I'll give it to you now.
Terrific, thanks, Johanna. To begin, I do want to recognize the tremendous impacts that the cascading events from June to December of 2021 had and continues to have on many British Columbians. So today, just a fair warning, I'll be sharing some images and accounts that may trigger for some people in the audience anxiety and fear. And if you need to, please listen without watching or take a short break and rejoin us when you're ready. I want to start with a reminder to everyone that wildfire is an essential process that drives ecosystem function and sustains biodiversity. However, when wildfire interacts with our homes, communities, and critical infrastructure, it becomes a threatening natural disaster. These images from the Weather Network show pyrocumulonimbus clouds from the Sparks Lake fire, one of the earliest fires last season. It really, the fire season of 2021 kind of epitomizes the fires that are being experienced around the world, driven by the climate emergency. Fires are exhibiting extraordinary behavior, burning at high intensity, spreading to large sizes, with extreme ecological and social impacts. And with more and more people living in our fire-prone environments, we find ourselves in a dangerous and potentially deadly situation. Let's go back a year ago from this week when that high pressure system began to develop in the southwestern United States, and I watched with anxiety as it was so reminiscent of 2017. And sure enough, that heat dome expanded north and brought with it record-setting temperatures here in British Columbia, but across Canada. The map on the left is showing at the end of June the departures, the difference between what we experienced in 2021 and average conditions for that same date at the end of June. And what it's showing you in those dark red colors is that our temperatures were between 15 and 20 degrees Celsius above average. Our overnight lows were what the daytime highs were supposed to be. And of course, culminating at the end of June was the record-breaking temperatures across much of British Columbia and expanding into other Western provinces of Canada, with Lytton earning the title of the hottest place in Canada at 49.6 degrees Celsius. That record exceeds the hottest temperature ever recorded in Las Vegas, Nevada. Let that sit with you for a moment. Hotter than Las Vegas, Nevada. This heat dome set in progress a suite of conditions that created very high fire danger, rapidly drying out the vegetation across BC. And you can see on the far left here, June 2021, where we had the entire province at high to extreme fire danger. Not unlike the peak of fire season in 2018 and 2017, the record years also in the last 5 years. And I'd like to point out that those heat and that fire danger greatly exceeded our historical norms, including Firestorm 2003. This heat primed us then for the catastrophic fire that burned through Lytton, the Lytton Creek fire that burned through the town of Lytton, ignited on June 30th and burned rapidly through the community with devastating effects. Over 90% of homes and structures were lost, and sadly, 2 lives were lost as well. These were the catastrophic results that have concerned me as not if, but when in British Columbia. I want to return to this heat dome and also point out that it's not only the heat within the heat dome itself, but it's the dynamics of the weather around it that drive so much of our fire season. We see here the jet stream forming loops instead of flowing west to east, and this omega block, as it's called, allowed that heat dome to persist. It's on the edges of that high pressure cell, and when that high pressure cell breaks down, that lightning is generated, which is of course an ignition source for fires. And what we're finding is with these high pressure domes and then the lightning that results as they break, we're getting multiple ignitions, hundreds of ignitions simultaneously over broad areas, challenging our firefighting resources. And we saw this not only in British Columbia, but across Western Canada with record fires in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Northwest Ontario last year as well, which taxes our national system because typically provinces and territories share resources in the peak of fire season. And so the heat dome and the weather-related incidents associated with it created a very, very intense fire season, not only in British Columbia, but elsewhere, taxing resources. In BC, it was our dry forests, much like 2017, that took the brunt of the fire season. Here we can see fire perimeters and evacuation alerts and orders around the communities in the Southern Cariboo and Thompson Okanagan region. And I've compiled some statistics here to share with you about our 2021 fire season. Over 1,600 fires, 35% of which were ignited by people. We spent 56 days in a state of emergency. Triggered by that heat dome, we had 40 ignitions per day for the first 2 weeks of July, triggered by those dry lightning storms. We shattered temperature records during the heat dome, creating the conditions conducive to fire. By mid or peak fire season, we had 300 fires burning simultaneously across our province, 67 fires of note threatening communities or within sight of communities. And ultimately, we were the 3rd highest area burned, despite our modern technology and our suppression efforts. Almost 870,000 hectares, 500,000 hectares in the Kamloops Forest region alone. 7 fires exceeded the Okanagan Mountain Park fire of 2003, our benchmark for extreme fires. And we spent $565 $1 million trying to suppress those fires. The consequence of the fires was severe, killing trees, burning organics, and burning deep into the soil. You can see on the left of this picture where a stump used to exist and the roots have burned out below ground, giving you a sense of the impacts of the fires. And remember too that many of these fires were on steep slopes and steep terrain, so that these hill slopes were very exposed and primed for the weather systems that occurred in the fall. We'd only been out of a state of emergency for a few days when yet again the weather changed, and here you see NASA's images representing the atmospheric rivers, consecutive atmospheric rivers in November of 2021 that funneled into the Fraser Valley and across our mountain systems, bringing with it record precipitation. And so we see here in this next picture the accumulation of rain, almost 300 millimeters in only a few days. And that rain occurred on top of snow that had already accumulated in our mountains. And so with the warming temperatures rapidly melting that snow and rain on top, the results were catastrophic. We had flooding not only in the lower mainland on the west or windward sides of the mountains, but on the lee side of the mountains, causing multiple communities to be evacuated with dire consequence. We saw landslides, mudslides, and impacts on our critical infrastructure that cut off Vancouver from the rest of the country for several days and several weeks. The tragedy of lost lives as well cannot be understated. So my message at the front end of this conversation today is that the costs of the fires and floods in 2021, the costs of these climate change impacts are in the billions of dollars, and we are already facing these consequences. And I think that brings to the front then some of the urgency in trying to address, to understand, and adapt to the climate changes that are coming to us.
Lori, thank you so much. I know that it's not easy to revisit the past year. I think that I have never personally felt the idea of climate anxiety more than I have this year. So thank you for getting us all on the same page. I want to kick things off by talking about the other big factor. You know, we know climate change is just a major, but one factor in the recent, not just wildfire season, but our last year. Can you take us through how current fire suppression and land management practices play a part in the wildfires we've been experiencing?
Absolutely. I'm going to share some images with you again and share some of the results from the research that my graduate students and team have been doing. So let's go back onto those images. Can you see those now? The answer to your question, if I can revisit this idea about our response to fire, our view or our understanding of fire allows us has this innate response that all fire is bad. And we've made, of course, the attempts to protect our lives and homes when fire is burning near communities. But that view has also expanded out so that we protect our livelihoods. And in British Columbia, that means our forests as well. And for many decades, we were highly successful, suppressing over 93% of fires across the landscape. That means in our collective lifetimes, we've only experienced the 7% of extreme fires that burn under hot, dry, windy conditions that exceed our suppression capabilities. The consequence is that the majority of fires, the good fires, the ones that burn at low intensity, that would damage but not kill trees, that clean up and maintain the ecosystem, well, those are the fires that we've been putting out. And so we've disrupted the way fire works in our forests, and as a result, the shape of the forests themselves. Many people may have taken a moment to count the tree or the rings on a stump of a tree, and normally rings form concentric circles around the center of the tree. So when you look at this tree, you might wonder, where's the center? the pith of the tree. What we're actually looking at here are fire scars on a ponderosa pine that survived 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 fires and still lived. And so these are low intensity fires, low severity effects that used to be a dominant portion of how our ecosystems in the dry parts of British Columbia functioned. Our research, and here I'm sharing with you a chart that summarizes the fire scars from hundreds of trees across many plots. Each of these triangles represents a time when one of those fire scars formed, and each line represents a different plot in the forest. And what it's showing you here is that in the Williams Lake area at UBC's Alex Fraser Research Forest, fires used to burn in the forest once every decade, and about once every 20 to 25 years in individual plots. But notice what happened starting in the late 1800s and through the 20th century. Those fire scars stopped, and they stopped for numerous reasons. One was that Indigenous fire stewardship was stopped through the process of colonization. And so that took away an important ignition source on our land. We also, as settlers arrived and we changed our land use and we began to suppress fire, thinking it would be damaging rather than good, we put out our fires and it began to change the way the forest is in our ecosystems. With more and more trees establishing and surviving, the forest became more dense and more homogeneous from place to place. It turns out that that is a factor that contributed to the massive mountain pine beetle epidemic that took place in British Columbia, affecting 19 million hectares of forests. Let's superimpose on that as well our industrial land practices, our forest management that has been accumulating on the landscape, aiming to sustain timber yields, but responding also to mountain pine beetle through salvage logging, so that by the time 2017 rolled around, this landscape on the Bonaparte Plateau burned at very high intensity when the 2017 Elephant Hill wildfire took place. And so we're seeing a shift from those surface fires that left scars and trees surviving towards these very high severity fires. And so it's really cumulatively these impacts over the 20th century, starting with colonization, these good intentions gone awry, the impacts on our forest composition, structure, insects, disease, and ultimately wildfire, all coming together in a perfect storm that's exacerbated by climate change.
Amazing. A picture really does tell 1,000 words, that ponderosa pine with the fire notches in it. We've already got a lot of questions. I just want to say on Slido. So if you haven't logged on already, slido.com, there's still time to ask questions. Thank you, everyone. I want to save as much time as possible to get to all of these questions. Just input the event code wildfires. I just want to ask one more before I turn to all of your questions. And Laura, you alluded to this, but what is the solution? How do we care for our forests if we want our environment, our communities, our economy to be more resilient in the future? And I know that's not an easy answer, but is there one?
Yeah, and I think it's a multi-part answer. So I'm going to share with you again some images to kind of collect those thoughts and show you how we've been thinking about this as we struggle with this question in my research group and amongst my collaborators and partners, partnerships across the province. So I am calling here for an urgent need for transformative change. We live today in the era of mega fires. As I've described to you, our focus on timber and homogenization of landscapes as a result has contributed to the problem. Finding our way out of this problem, we're discovering there's policy conflicts, there's barriers to innovation, and there's resistance to some of the proactive fuels mitigation that we could be doing. We feel that this is leaving our communities very vulnerable. I would also want to go forward to say that many of us are very naive about how fire-prone the environments are that we live in, and that lack of understanding and knowledge makes us vulnerable, but also contributes to a lack of political will. to move forward, to make the investments and changes that are required. So how do we transform from this era of mega fires to instead learn to coexist with fire, to live with it in our landscape rather than trying to stop it, but to live with good fire, the fire that rejuvenates biodiversity and gives us landscape heterogeneity? I'm going to start from the top of this diagram and work our way right down to the individuals in our society to pose some solutions and some of the changes that are both underway and need to ramp up with urgency. The first is to diversify our wildfire management. And the wildfire management branch, the strategic plan that they initiated in 2012, began the first step towards that. Their mandate used to be to put out all fires, but we recognize now that when it's safe to do so, wildfires should be allowed to burn in the cool, wet springs like the one we're experiencing this year. This encourages sustainability, healthy and resilient ecosystems. And so modified response, a type of management where we allow fire back onto the landscape, is one first and important key step. The second is to use fire to fight fire. Under the right conditions, in cool, wet conditions, in combination with active, proactive management, prescribed burn guided by both Indigenous knowledge and Western science and our best knowledge of historical fire regimes can guide restoration work that enables both the restoration of ecosystems, but mitigates fuels that have accumulated through forest change. Where fire, another step is to diversify our forest management. And here we need a radical shift away from our focus on timber production to sustain the economy. Our economy is already seeing hits of these changes, climate related, with insects and fire and their interactions. So we need to address the mismatch between the disturbances that we impose on the landscape through our forest management and the historical frequency, size, and magnitude of natural disturbances like fire and insects and pathogens, and to bring these more in line with one another across all scales, from landscapes to individual trees. There are places on the landscape where yes.
No, sorry to interrupt. I know we've got a lot of questions about Indigenous methods of wildfire management, so I won't cut you off, but know that that's where we're going to go next.
Okay, fantastic. And just a couple more points to wrap up. There are places on our landscapes where we want to use proactive fuels mitigation. And so here I wanted to share an example from our community forests where we've been working across landscapes where there have been some treatments to remove understory trees and to reduce the density of the forest, to restore the structures that we think were there prior to fire suppression. And then we've used computer models to show both how there's diversity in the forest, even in the non-treated sites. Those measurements plus fire behavior modeling tell us that without treatment, 68% of the forest would burn as an active or passive crown fire, with fairly rapid rates of spread, as shown here in meters per minute. When we add treatments to reduce the fuel loads, leaving the big fire-resistant trees behind, but reducing the fuel loads and the ladder fuels, we shift the potential for fire towards surface fire and slower moving fire, so that we actually create defensible space in the forest surrounding communities. And we saw success for this in the community of Logan Lake, where fire burned within meters of homes last year, and where there had been no treatment. We had high mortality and scorch to both trees and the ground, and yet where the treatments had taken place, more trees survived with less impact from fire. So we know that these treatments are both, can be effective. And lastly, I want to put the challenge back out to the audience and ask, are you fire smart? Because part of the responsibility comes right back to us. Fire smart begins at home. And I want you to look at these pictures and see if you can see the fire dumb mistakes, the fuels accumulating on the roof, the source of ignition, and the accelerant right next to your home. These are things we want to avoid through fire smart choices to protect our homes and create defensible space. So across scales, whether we're talking from government initiatives right down to individual homeowners, there are things that we can do to coexist with wildfire.
Lori, I think one of our colleagues, a wildland ecologist, once said there is no smoke option in the future, and that really stuck with me. It's sort of, how do you want your smoke in the future? Again, thank you everyone for sending in your Slido questions. There's still time, but let's get right to them. Great engagement from all of you. The top voted question, really in line with what you were just talking about, Lori. What are our current Indigenous methods of wildfire management that are employed in BC right now?
Yeah, so we've made some moves in British Columbia. There has been pilot studies working with the First Nations Emergency Services Society, also collaborating with BC Wildfire Service, but rooted in communities to reintroduce cultural fire back on the landscape. And there's a tremendous response from communities around BC. Many of my collaborators, many of the communities that we have interviewed and spoken with, that my graduate students are collaborating with, have expressed the desire to get cultural fire back on their landscapes, to reintroduce fire stewardship for multiple reasons. Fire was used to cultivate plants, medicinal plants, food plants, to create forage for game, to create protection for communities. And so working with elders and fire knowledge keepers, developing a new way to introduce prescribed fire. I think it's important for us to remember prescribed fire, as BC Wildfire Service and Western scientists have practiced, has many regulations and controls around it that don't benefit from that cultural knowledge and the knowledge that comes from fire keepers. So modifying those programs to reintroduce fires back onto traditional territories, not just on reserve, but more broadly across traditional territories, is one of the ways where communities, First Nations communities and Indigenous people have asked for sovereignty over their lands. It's a form of reconciliation, and it's also a way to mitigate fuels and to create protection for many of those Indigenous communities that are in fairly remote areas and are in very fire-prone environments.
Bringing prescribed fires back is one of the biggest solutions then. This is our second top voted question on slido.com. How do we get the general public more supportive of prescribed burns and cultural burning?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think really it comes from education and understanding, seeing the successes when we do have, when we can get fire back on the landscape. And there have already been successful burns, multiple burns this spring. The communities of Kimberley, of Williams Lake, the Escat First Nation, the Silkatine, all have had successful burns this year. There's more fires planned for the fall. And remember, we don't ever have prescribed burns in the heat of the summer. The value of prescribed burning, not only do we mitigate against accumulated fuels, we restore ecosystems, we revitalize biodiversity and habitat for many endangered species. And remember too that prescribed burns, we can do them while letting people know that the fire is coming. We can tell you there's going to be smoke for the next few days. It's going to start at 10 in the morning and it will continue for about 48 hours monitored. It'll be a lower dose of smoke than we've been getting in the heat of the summer. And I am grateful to say the communities with whom I've collaborated, the places where I've worked in recent years, the knowledge and understanding is absolutely increasing in BC. And many communities are asking, when is it our turn for the next prescribed burn?
Just a quick follow-up for me. I know it's hard to put a number on, how many prescribed burns we need because it's so variable, but, I remember learning recently how many more prescribed burns are happening south of the border compared to what we're doing here. Can you put that into context just quickly?
Well, there's more prescribed burning happening in Florida and New Jersey than in British Columbia. So Florida is full of people who are retired. So we often think, you know, elderly and resistance maybe to fire for health impacts, and yet places like Florida are very successfully have a prescribed burn program that people have learned to coexist with that small amount of smoke and those fires to protect them from the bigger conflagrations that they have experienced in the past and that we are experiencing now. So I think really it's a matter of building our capacity, getting the confidence from the public, and getting those fires back on the ground under controlled situations.
Just to switch focus, this is another top voted question on Slido. Can you speak to forest management and the effect on floods? You know, there are large clear cuts, and most of the pine beetle killed forest was harvested. That was a question that got a lot of votes.
Yeah, and so one of the things, and so this is a little bit outside of my expertise, but you know, I'd had a lot of opportunity to talk with Eunice about this and the interactions between fire and harvesting and the types of changes to the hydrologic system and flooding that we've seen. And so let me see if I can pull that answer to answer it, because it's an important topic as well. When we open up the forest, whether it's through fire or through harvesting, we really change the amount of forest cover and the protective cover down onto the ground. And so that shifts the way in which moisture interacts with the ground, but also the way in which snow accumulates and then melts in the spring. So those are significant changes to the hydrologic regime. Not having the plants, the large trees to take up the moisture and to go through the evapotranspiration process is another shift. And so as we harvest trees through clear cuts, and we've done a lot of salvage logging in many parts of British Columbia, we create those openings and shift the way that the water is interacting with the land. Eunice was really emphatic when we spoke about, we used to have controls and constraints that said only 25% of any given watershed could be harvested and be opened up through clear-cut logging at any given time. And that it takes you know, a minimum of 15 plus years to recolonize trees on those sites, but it's decades before the hydrology of the pre-harvest forest is regenerated. And so the long-term effects as we harvest our forests and the changes in the hydrologic flows, the increase in the amount or volumes of water coming off of that land have long-term consequences. Through the mountain pine beetle affected salvage logging that we've done, we've increased the proportion of watersheds that are being harvested. And so we have very large areas, as that video showed, the cumulative effects over 20, 30 years of harvesting, very large areas that with only young forests on them. That means that there's greater runoff and greater water accumulation, so that when we have atmospheric river events, when we have spring freshets, we do see more water coming off of those sites and coming down in pulses, contributing to flooding and potentially to landslides and mudslides.
Yeah, thanks for making that connection, Lori. Nice job. Not surprised you have a solid overview, but you're right. It is so important as I mentioned earlier, we're still to get into our very delayed full spring melt. And I know there's a lot of concern that those burn scars from last summer are going to play a role.
And the burn scars are another, they even superimpose again on the amount of harvesting in our landscape. So both are disturbances that are having effects on the hydrologic regime. Our other concern, especially in the first few years after fires that have burned so intensely that they've burned all those organics and burned the roots out of the ground even, they create hydrophobic soils. The soils repel the water as opposed to absorbing it. So we get a lot of overland flow, and that overland flow takes with it the ash and the mineral soil and begins to wash then into headwater streams and downstream. A lot of material that, again, is contributing to the types of hugely erosive events that we've seen during the atmospheric rivers of November 2021.
Lori, another question that's getting a lot of upvotes right now. You mentioned thinning as a useful tool, but our tenure stumpage system does not incentivize licenses to this. Can we change this?
Yeah, we need to. There is a lot of policy change that needs to take place. As I said, some of the more innovative things that we could be doing to make really rapid progress, there's barriers to it, and some of it are policy barriers. For example, until this year, every time we thinned the forest and reduced the number of trees to mitigate fuels, well, if that patch of forest was part of our timber harvesting land base, we had to replant trees and regrow them after a place where we've just removed them to reduce the latter fuels. So it was counterproductive. We had to ask permission for an exemption on each and every site. And so there's new rules now that are accommodating for fuels mitigation. We need to, the stocking standards, what you replant and how many trees you need to replant, is now taking into account the primary goal of fire mitigation as opposed to restocking and regenerating a forest for timber yield into the future. And we need to think not only about just that one regeneration stage, but to think broadly on our landscape about some of the problems that we have unintentionally caused by focusing on timber production and forest products outcomes, and really shift our thinking to be more holistic, to be focusing on the resilience of our forests. And that means shifts in the way that we manage not only how we harvest, but also what we regenerate, the densities to which we regenerate, and our expectations and timelines about where we will reharvest forests and at what point in the future. And it will mean some economic costs in the short term, but it will allow us to sustain our forests and maintain our communities in the long term.
Lori, great follow-up question, just to dig down on what you were just saying. Why does logging increase fire hazard? Doesn't logging reduce the fuel load? Observation of previous wildfires, plantations seem to act as a natural wildfire break. Interesting question here.
Yeah, and I think it really depends. Remember, when we're harvesting, there's multiple components to that harvest. So there's removing the biomass from the trees, but in doing so, you leave behind a lot of fine fuels. We leave behind tree tops and branches and small pieces of materials, which are really the fine fuels. If you were going to have a campfire, you'd start with those fine fuels, which means they're very flammable. It used to be historically, up to the 1990s, after harvesting the trees, we would use prescribed burns, broadcast burning, to go in and burn a light burn over the area that had just been harvested, to burn off those fine fuels, the kindling for future fires, to turn that to ash, to incorporate it into the soil and contribute to the next generation of trees. It also contributed to creating sites where you could plant trees safely. Well, due to concerns about smoke and escaped prescribed fires, prescribed burns, and other concerns, we stopped using prescribed fire as part of our silviculture or forest tending processes. And so now when we harvest, we leave behind a lot of that fine fuel. It sometimes gets stacked into giant piles, the size of houses and buildings, that then get burned under, again, cool, wet conditions. That's a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. So that fine fuel, the fine fuels, though, are often left on site. And what we saw, especially with mountain pine beetle affected fuels, when we were salvaging those dead trees, we left behind a lot of fine fuel on those sites. We didn't use prescribed burn to mitigate them. And so those cut blocks, the cut blocks since the 1990s, especially those that were harvested during mountain pine beetle, they have a lot of fuel on them. And we see that they actually burn very intensely and are contributing to the wildfire problem as opposed to part of the solution.
We've talked a lot about historical fire regime. Question here about new innovative techniques. Can you talk about, as far as solutions, are there any innovative techniques being researched or implemented right now?
Yeah, in terms of how do we take that historical information and translate that into forest management?
Or just interesting solutions when it comes to fire management, technology-based solutions that we might not have heard about are being developed right now. I remember hearing, and I don't know how far we are along, but thoughts to take all of that biomass and turn them into pellets and use them to build structures. I'm not sure where we are with that, but I think those kinds of technology-based solutions.
Absolutely. So there is tremendous opportunity. We're creating a lot of biomass. When we thin the forest, we're taking the small trees, We're taking the understory trees, the ones that are the ladder fuels. These are not trees that are the right dimension to become, you know, the types of traditional forest products that we have made. This is not 2x4 material. Rather, this is a lot of biomass that typically when we remove it from the forest, a lot of it just gets burned. Some of it can become merchantable, can move across into that forest products, but wouldn't it be lovely if we could come up with innovative solutions that use that biomass rather than burning it and putting the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, albeit under controlled conditions? Imagine if we could put that into the bioenergy, that we could use it as part of a bioenergy solution. If we could use that fiber in other ways, there's all sorts of tremendous opportunities. And I have colleagues in the Faculty of Forestry who are kind of producing new products and using wood and wood fiber in new ways that really take advantage of some of that biomass, as opposed to using it or treating it only as waste wood. And so the kinds of incentives, we need to think more, we need to be innovative, we need to be creative about thinking about getting that biomass out of the forest and then how to use it to the best of our ability. I think there's many places in the world that just don't have the standard of living and the opportunities that we have here in British Columbia and in Canada, who I think would be, quite frankly, shocked at how wasteful we are with much of that material.
Lori, when we do think about replanting, a question here, how do we create diversity when sites are replanted?
Yeah. We have made the mistake, I think, in the past of really focusing, and many people have commented on this besides myself. We have really focused on species like lodgepole pine, a natural early successional tree species that grows rapidly and has been really expedient for planting and regrowing forests when our primary goal is timber production. But quite frankly, we have generations of trees that are growing up in pure lodgepole pine stands that we know now are the next generation of food for a future mountain pine beetle outbreak. And also by focusing only on single species or even on conifer species, as opposed to allowing the natural processes of disturbance and diverse forests to naturally regenerate, that would include both conifer or needle-leaf trees and the broadleaf trees like aspen and birch and other broadleaves that regenerate naturally in British Columbia. We try to fast track succession, that kind of stage in the forest where broadleaf trees are co-occurring and growing with the conifers, often thinking that the cost was to the growth and the production of biomass in our conifer trees. And so we've really favored the conifers over a more diverse collection of species in the forest at our peril. We now know that those uniform monocultures or a focus on conifers without the mixture of broadleaf trees in our landscape make our forests more susceptible to insects and less resilient to fire. The broadleaf trees tend to burn at lower intensity and exhibit different fire behavior, less intense fire behavior than in the conifer forest. So where we allow broadleaf trees to naturally regenerate, to colonize, and to, rather than removing them by brushing or using herbicides, if we allowed them to recolonize with our conifers, and know that it might take a little bit longer for the conifer trees that we want to harvest in future to be ready to be harvested, I think the short-term gains for the long-term cost are definitely worth it.
I want to try and get in at least a couple more questions. There's so many amazing questions, so thank you. Lori, I think we have to talk about the upcoming wildfire season. What areas of the province, as we start the season off on a cool and soggy note, what areas of the province are you concerned about in the upcoming months?
Frankly, all of the province, because I don't think any of us are ready. Our communities are not resilient. We don't have the fuels mitigation and the protection zones around communities across our province, nor do I think are most homes fire smart. And so my big picture answer is eventually all of us are going to have to address this issue. in the short term, you know, if I could pull out a crystal ball or a magic 8-ball and give you an answer, it would be fantastic. We've had a cool, wet start to the fire season and a cool spring. It's a La Nina year and we have lots of snow. So in the short term, flooding is our bigger concern rather than fire. But we said that in 2017 and 2018, our 2 record fire seasons as well. I'm a little concerned for the southern interior of BC. Although it has been cool, it's been dry. So they had below average precipitation in the early part of the spring, and there's snowpacks. Although they have a healthy snowpack in the mountains, it's not exceeding, you know, kind of normal snowpacks the way it did on the coast and some of the higher mountains in the north. We've already got fire season has started up north. It often starts earlier than in the southern part of the province. So fires are already burning in northern BC. But again, under cooler and wetter conditions, this is the perfect year for modified response and managed wildfire so that we can get that fire back, diversifying the landscape. So if you hear about fires that are burning and being allowed to burn because they're not threatening homes and communities, that's a good thing this year. That's something that should be happening. My concern definitely is on the Southern Cariboo, Thompson, Okanagan, and down in the Rocky Mountain Trench. Those are our hottest and driest environments in the province. They're the places that have been very prone to fire, as we've seen in 2017, 2018, and 2021. They're also the places that are already experiencing some drought.
Should be writing this down for my forecast tonight. But yes, it's been interesting as a meteorologist to see all of these systems coming in from the southwest, unusual for this time of the year, loading the western facing slopes. And we've got this, you know, drought setting up in the Okanagan. I think we've got one more question, Lori, before I leave it to you for some final thoughts. And again, I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's question. So nice to see so much engagement. And this is a big one, but in sort of a couple minutes, Lori, what do you think, what provincial policies need to change for us to better tackle climate change? Yeah, policies that might help in the big fight.
Yeah. Oh, that's the $1 million question.
To the end.
We need, clearly, all of society needs to be working towards reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So any policies, any practices that are going to help us to reduce our greenhouse gases are going to be essential. I still think we need transformative change. I feel as though we are still tinkering when we talk about forest management in our province. I don't think we're understanding the magnitude of the impacts that are coming towards us. This is only the beginning of a really dramatic change that I see happening in our forests. And we really, really need to urgently and transform how we manage our forests. And that means dramatic changes on the timber harvesting land base. It means reductions to the annual allowable cut. It means shifting towards thinking about how to become resilient, to have resilient and healthy ecosystems in an era of climate emergency.
And just quickly to sneak in sort of on the end of that, do you think part of those policies and solutions is needing to start accounting for wildfire emissions, since, you know, we're seeing mega fires increasingly caused by our actions?
Absolutely. The carbon emissions that we have seen from our wildfires are exceeding all other emissions in our province together. So when 2017, 2018, 2021, when we are emitting 2 and 3 times as much greenhouse gas into the atmosphere during wildfire season, but it doesn't count to our balance on our spreadsheet, it means that we need to be even more vigilant and reduce our emissions wherever we can to account for those changes, but we also need to make the dramatic changes needed to reduce the wildfires that are emitting those that amount of greenhouse gas. So this really is that urgent call for transformative change, not only to mitigate against further global warming, but also to protect our communities and ourselves as individuals and homeowners.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your excellent questions. Before I close the program, though, Lori, I want to give you a chance to provide sort of a brief final thought for our audience. You know, what do you want us to all think about first and foremost when we leave here today?
Well, thank you, Johanna. And I'm going to share one more time some slides here and return to our transformative change. And I want to acknowledge, first of all, this tremendous research team that has been working with me and has survived COVID-19, working by Zoom, out in the forest, collecting data and working so hard in collaboration with communities across British Columbia to search for solutions to these urgent problems. I also want to say a special thank you to the many collaborators and agencies that fund our research, the many First Nations communities, community forests, and towns, municipalities across British Columbia who have been such excellent partners in our research. And finally, Johanna, to answer your question, I want to say to the audience today that the wildfires of 2017, 2018, and now 2021 cannot be another wake-up call. Our forests, our communities, our homes are not resilient to climate change. Transformative change is urgently needed for us to coexist with wildfire. Please take the time to think about how you can be part of the solution. Be fire smart, be wise about climate, reduce your greenhouse gases, and take action today. Thank you.
Lori, thank you so much. I always learn so much from you, and I know I wasn't alone today, and I hope that I don't have to frantically call you this fire season, panicked from CBC, but my apologies in advance for when that happens. Thank you, Lori. And I now invite Rob back for some closing remarks.
Great, thanks, Joanna. Yeah, I learned a lot too. What a fascinating dialogue. Thank you to the audience for your engagement and your amazing questions. That was terrific. So a huge thank you to Joanna for doing such a great job of moderating today. Really wonderful. So thank you, and thanks to Lori for sharing her expertise and her fire smarts. As you can see, Lori is such a wonderful and generous and smart colleague, one of many here at the UBC Faculty of Forestry who are teaching future generations to be stewards of this place that we call planet Earth. Something that I think we need more than ever, especially if we wish to respond to, I think, the urgent need for transformative change, the transformative change that Lori spoke of earlier. I want to also take this opportunity to thank all of our viewers, our UBC alumni and friends for joining us today. If you're interested in learning more about some of the great work we're doing at the Faculty of Forestry, I'd encourage you to visit our website, www.forestry.ubc.ca. And if you want to revisit this conversation or share it with others, the video of this virtual program will be available very soon at trekmagazine.ca/webcast. The address is there on your screen. So that's about it. I'll close off today. I just want to thank everyone and I wish everyone well as we head into the summer. Thanks for joining us. Stay safe, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.